okay, we're going to take those structures away. We admit that it doesn't work. When you do that, which is what's happening with the ťKhomani Sun right now, they suddenly flourish.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Fleming Puckett, a man with 6 degrees who used to work as a New York attorney before turning his attention towards education and the San people of the Kalahari, also known as Bushmen. The central point to his work seems to be the exercise and use of power to gain wealth and personal resources to the exclusion of certain groups of people, such as the San. Now, we have a fascinating conversation about this, and we touch on some key points, such as tourism, the purpose and the use of tourism, the question of education being the silver bullet, leadership structures, participatory democracy, and how the democracy the San people practice may be different but also complementary to the democracy we practice in the West and what we may be lacking. Sovereignty and land, government, the purpose of policy, identity and the importance of identity in constructing societies and cultures, and a final anecdote from Fleming about an ostrich mating dance on his first visit to the Kalahari, which I thought was pretty funny and also pretty fitting for the end of this episode. Now, if you like this show, please give it a rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use. You can also do the same thing on Facebook, where you can give us a recommendation. You can also go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca to listen to all previous episodes and let me know what you think of this episode or any other. Give your feedback at that website to my email or on social media. And please get in touch to let me know what you think about future episodes, who we should have on this show, and what we should be discussing. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, Fleming Puckett, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
We're here in beautiful Saskatoon, although it's kind of gray Saskatoon today. So I'm really excited to chat with you for a multitude of reasons. Number one, you're a very highly educated man. I think you have 6 degrees. Is that right?
That's what they tell me.
That's what they keep calling you to tell you. We've got these degrees. You got to come pick them up. Hello. And you are also you spent a lot of time studying the people of the Kalahari Desert, especially the San people.
That's right.
Am I saying that right, San?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Some people say San, some people say San.
Right.
It's all a kind of a regional thing. But,
right.
Yeah.
And colloquially, it used to be the Bushmen.
That's right.
Like decades and decades ago.
Except that's a really good point, because I like to let them tell me what they like to be called. Mm. And so different groups would prefer to be called different things.
Right.
In South Africa now, it's sort of politically correct to call them Khoisan. They tend not to like that because it's a combination of the San people and the Khwe or Khwe, because those groups, we believe, split off quite a while back, with the Khwe becoming much more focused on animal husbandry and agriculture, while the San people generally stayed hunter-gatherers. So, of course, both groups have been very adaptable over time, so they've modified how they've related to the environment and the things they were able to hunt and gather within that environment over time. But the different groups will also just ask you to say, no, call me ťKhomani or call me Kung, or sort of different groups. So I just let them dictate. And some are still saying, please call me Bushman. I feel like I'm a Bushman.
Right, right.
There's no good answer, because all of the original terms that came out for the groups, aside from their own community names, like I was saying, ťKhomani and Kung, they were names that came from outside, and they tended to be translated in one form or another as person on the edge of society. So there are really no good answers for what to call them. It's a very complicated question.
Which is also, but it's interesting because I think it's a complicated question for any human being. Because when you say, what label should you have? Well, I can have many labels. I can be called a white person. I can be called a male person. I can be called blonde or brunette, depending on the day, I guess, depending on the angle of the sun. And, these seem quite simplistic terms, and they are. but how do I label myself? Do I label myself as a podcaster? Do I label myself as a Canadian, as originally an Albertan, or I'm living in Ontario now? Like, what is it? And I think that the more we try to slice and dice, the more we might be losing a sense of humanity that is actually connecting us all. It's something that I want to talk about in a little bit, but I don't want to miss our first question. I don't want to give you. I don't want to miss giving you that opportunity.
Yes,
so no, don't be. It was me. I was the one asking you the questions. So Fleming, I wanted to ask you, as I always do, and this is a deliberately broad question for a deliberately broad response. What on earth is going on?
I love that question. I don't have a wonderful answer for it kind of already. But one of the things I thought about that sort of naturally comes out of my own thinking is that, and I'm sure you've had folks mention this before, but I feel like we all live in our own smaller worlds. And I'm seeing that more and more as I travel. I travel to 2 or 3 locations a week with my job these days, and I see lots of folks who are very much sort of self-absorbed in their own little worlds, and including a great example that I love. I always want to get the window seat on the airplane. And it's because I want to look out the window.
Same.
And I can't believe the number of people these days on airplanes who are sitting in the window seat and never even look out the window. We could be flying through Oregon past volcanic peaks, and they're looking at their phone, and it really I don't know. It says a lot about where we may be going as individuals and as a society. In the larger sphere, what my work really involves across the world is the exercise of power and the use of that power to gain wealth and personal resources to the exclusion of so many other folks. And one of the reasons that I first got into my Kalahari research was because I came from what some would call a privileged background. Obviously, it's difficult to go out there and get all those degrees, as you mentioned, and they're from what I consider to be great universities,
like Oxford, Cambridge,
for example.
Yeah.
And actually, my work started out very much as just going down this route of doing finance and law. And
yeah, because you were admitted to the New York State Bar in 2002, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, I was. Yes, and went to work in the legal field and realized as an attorney, my role in so many cases in New York, which is very much of a finance-based kind of legal market, was all about making rich people richer. And some people loved that. And some of my colleagues, it became so much money-oriented.
You mean loved the work?
Loved the actual work,
right.
and loved this idea of being creative in order to create additional wealth for individuals. And so much of their focus was on money to the extent that at lunch they would go shopping for new giant TVs, and they would go test driving cars after work and all this. And it became so much about money and consumption, and some people that's a huge motivator, and I understand that. It didn't work for me. And so as I was kind of riding the train back and forth from Connecticut to New York at the time, I started reading about indigenous people's land claims and really starting to see the power imbalances in so many places around the world. Just as a kind of a case in point here, so many people were annoyed or frustrated by the donors, the philanthropists, the business folks who stepped forward to contribute to Notre Dame, to the rebuilding of Notre Dame, right? When that happened.
In Paris, yeah.
In Paris, exactly. And so many people were expressing frustration. How could you give so much money to this edifice when you could have spent the same amount of money helping to solve world hunger and things like that? And to me, I mean, I can understand that level of frustration, but everyone chooses to donate and to give to causes that they believe in. At the same time, I'm very much of a believer, and I read a lot about the great work that the UN does and the World Food Program and these other things. So much of the example that was brought up for Notre Dame, so much of world hunger has to do with political issues and infrastructure issues in the countries where these hungry folks are. And so in many cases, just donating a pile of cash doesn't end up having the types of impacts that people expected it to have.
Well, and donating money is a very emotional act, too. It's not just rational. You know, for example, if I see an advertisement on my computer, on my phone, or whatever, with a really cute dolphin, my heartstrings might get pulled, and I might think, oh, they need my help. That cute dolphin or that starving dog needs my help. If I saw a picture of tuna being massacred, tuna being an growingly endangered species in the ocean, I wouldn't, that's not cute to me, and it's also tuna as food. So, but what is the functional difference between tuna and a dolphin? Is a dolphin smarter? Well, I guess so, but does that mean it's more valuable as a living being? And if we're going to say that, then I guess we should get rid of people without a university degree, for example, or without 6 of them. But do you know what I mean? Like we're dealing, because donating money or because philanthropy is an emotional exercise, then we're leaving the marketplace to the rampage of emotions, as opposed to, where can we best put our resources to best use to maximize utility according to certain values, right? And I really appreciate what you're talking about here with, the first thing you mentioned about the world seems to be getting smaller and smaller for people. And I wonder, just to go back to that quickly, if this is new, if this idea of the emotion that is in donating money or philanthropy is new, if this sense that money is a dominant part of our world that you mentioned earlier, that everyone is, if you're a New York attorney, you're focused on money and creating money gives you joy. Is that new, or is it just an acceleration of what came before, or is it just that are we being chronocentric? Are we assuming that everything is new because of our time?
That's a great point. I do think that certainly the free flow of money around the globe is certainly much more than it ever used to be. But certainly the idea of personal accumulation and sort of taking as many resources from as many parts of the world. I mean, right, the first publicly traded companies had to do with the Dutch East India kind of operations, right, and kind of monetizing some of those things done by some folks in Scotland to create this idea of shares. And so that's a very old concept. One thing that I find interesting is that back in the day, folks who were going out on these expeditions to kind of collect resources and go in and explore Africa, for example, they were suddenly off the radar when it came to the eyes of society. And in many cases, that led to quite a number of atrocities being committed by folks who, everyone believed were kind of upstanding European citizens in that particular case, but who once they were in the old phrase, on the dark continent, and really in many cases that means that they were out of the eyes, they were out of public view. Suddenly that kind of lust for accumulation and feeling of not having necessarily consequences for their actions led to an enormous amount of kind of awful things happening there. And so I think maybe for the case of philanthropy, these days, because we're much more have much more awareness of things that are happening around the world, it's possible for us to see what's going on, get emotional about it, and make contributions that do end up being helpful. I mean, of course, not all New York attorneys are only interested in money,
right?
And at the same time, there are lots of great charities out there who are doing great work to try to combat some of the political inequality that's leading to the marginalization and hunger of so many groups.
Well, and a lot of this, I mean, you're right, not all New York attorneys might be focused on generating wealth, but all of them have to have an understanding of wealth as it operates in our society today, right? I mean, like, that's just what we do. I would almost say that if you're going to school in Canada, United States, Britain, wherever in the Western world, and you're not learning about the stock market, for example, you're really not learning about the way the world works. Because whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, whether we think we should have a revolution and overthrow the capitalists or not, it doesn't matter, because that's the way the world works around us. And if a 15-year-old kid is in in high school and not appreciating that, then they're actually not appreciating how the world works. and the answer to the question, what on earth is going on? And I think that what's interesting about this sort of, this cognitive dissonance that we have is you made this example of the explorers, quote unquote, in Africa. Well, the Congo is a great example of that, and as it was called, the Belgian Congo, under King Leopold of Belgium. And they knew what was going on there. The people who were running this show in the Congo knew that this was a massive exercise in exploitation, in pseudo-slavery, in awful degradation of human beings in that part of the world. And yet at the same time, they called it a humanitarian exercise. That Belgium was this grand European country, small, didn't want a place on the world stage, but was going to do good work in the dark continent and help bring these people up into the good life. And they knew that they were telling a false story as they were exploiting the resources of the Congo. And I just wonder, I know that this stuff happens today, maybe not at the same level, but in your work in the Kalahari for the last 10 years, because I think you first went there in 2009, is that right?
Wow.
So I guess 10 years ago.
That's amazing. Thanks for pointing that out.
I wonder if you still see that kind of thing happening, like not just people who are cognitively dissonant, who pretend that they don't see it, but who actually see it and don't care and put a label on it and move on.
Mm-hmm. We see a lot of that in the tourism industry in particular. I know that the San people have been the subject of quite a lot of the gaze of the outsider, the sense of otherness, people coming to the Kalahari in order to see what in their mind would be an image of early man, which of course is absolutely absurd, right? Because all kind of modern human beings are fully evolved modern human beings.
Right, right.
And so the problem that we see is that so many folks have an image in their mind of what the Kalahari is and what San people should look like, and therefore they come to the Kalahari in order to see that and to consume that in some way, satisfying their own sense of, well, I am not of this. I am a well-off person from Europe. I'm coming here to see these others, and then it kind of reinforces my place in the hierarchy of the world. And then
it's kind of like going to the zoo in a way.
It is a bit, and we do see that. And in many cases, the problem is that the San people are expected to perform based on those preconceived ideas in the minds of the tourists. And if the San people don't look or behave the way they are expected to, many of these, and it tends to be Europeans, they'll almost force them to go and put on their loincloths and do some dances for them and pose for them to get pictures taken. So there is a conflict there. At the same time, the San people are very intelligent and of course have kind of adopted the ownership of this particular image that they're realizing more and more has economic value. And so in a way, in some of the really great examples out there, they are able to exploit in some ways the preconceptions of the Europeans by saying, look, sure, we'll dress up for you and you pay to have this experience, but you must also come see where we actually live and understand the political oppression that we feel and the hunger that we feel and the restrictions that we have on our land ownership and the ability to hunt and gather, encroachments from other groups within Southern Africa that aren't kind of stopped or even recognized by the national governments, all of these other things. So trying to include more of a realistic picture of how they're living today, but certainly taking that sense of agency over their own image and saying, for some of us, we choose to do this so that we can have some economic value. It's a way of gathering something new. It's gathering tourist dollars, but they're doing it with a full understanding of the complexities of the situation.
But do you think that there's still a problem there and that there's a power imbalance, right? You mentioned power a little while ago, and really this is what we're talking about. And in Canada, it's also true with the Indigenous peoples in this country, right? Our country has tried to empower Indigenous peoples because they have been forced to lack power for so long. But that, in the way that I just phrased it, in and of itself, contains an assumption of where the power lies. I give you power, right? And Europeans can give power to the San people by bringing their money. And the expectation that the San people have to perform creates a power dynamic that is not dissimilar to African-American minstrels at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, or even prostitution, if we're going to talk about that, right? So a lot of people have argued that, well, a woman selling her body knowingly, without being forced into it, has the right to do so and can be empowered to do so and can make money off of it, for example. But we know when we hear that even if we think, okay, I guess morally it's okay if we make it decriminalized, but we know that there's a power imbalance there. It's in the actual language that we've just used. And I just wonder, how far down this line can we go without being, can we go down this line and be sustainable if we're talking about Europeans or North Americans coming to the Kalahari and engaging in this way, if the people there are still expected to perform? Is there still a power imbalance there?
There definitely is, and there definitely is even within the countries themselves, not including sort of the tourists. So one of the San people once told me, he said, we're at the bottom of any ladder that you could ever imagine. And that really sort of shows their feeling of no matter who is kind of coming into the country, the original owners, if you can call them that, of Southern Africa were the San people. They were all the way across Southern Africa.
And for tens of thousands of years.
Exactly.
And I read that there are about 115,000 San people today. And that their people have been there for about up to 70,000 years.
That's right. And we're finding more and more evidence that might be pushing that back to 100,000 or even more.
The dawn of humanity.
Exactly. And some of the crafts that they have created, some of the ostrich eggshell beads that they're famous for, we're finding evidence of those going way, way back. So they've always been a people who have been pushed aside by other groups coming in. And earlier, just a few thousand years ago, it was the Bantu speaking people who migrated down along kind of Eastern Africa and into South Africa, and they pushed the San people one direction. Then the Dutch and the British showed up on the other side of the country and pushed them in the other direction. What's interesting today is that even though we have the wonderful Republic of South Africa, that there's still enormous power imbalances there. So part of that has to do with the fact that the San people are considered a minority by everyone. So it doesn't matter if it's white folks in power or if it's Africans, as they call they can be called African or black, various things within South Africa. The San people always get left out of that. And there's a lot of exploitative sort of things that happen. So the motto of South Africa is in an old San language. So they took the imagery of the history of the San and hunter-gatherers in Southern Africa, but then the people today kind of don't feel that they have the respect or the political representation that even normal citizens of South Africa would have. So they're still being pushed to the margins. And it's something that's definitely ongoing, and it's a power imbalance even within the.
Well, and this is what you've studied. That why are people not involved in the decision-making process? For example, in Botswana, where I think the majority of the San people are in Botswana. Is that correct?
There are a lot in Botswana and a lot in Namibia as well. Those are two very large.
And South Africa, obviously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
South Africa is ultimately a smaller population than those two. There are also small populations in Zimbabwe and Zambia as well. So there is some kind of spread out. But yeah, the Botswana is a place with a large population. In Namibia, the population is large, and it's the place where many of the groups, and there we're talking about Kung people or Jutwansi people who were pushed to the edge of sort of far north and eastern Namibia. The reason was ultimately that the governments back in the day couldn't figure out what to do with that land anyway, so the San people may as well have it. But as a result of that land being considered not worth anything, those San people in Namibia are actually the ones who have the closest connection to a lot of their traditional practices, because they've always been out on the land and in most cases able to practice a lot of their traditional hunting and gathering sort of methods, and are still able to do so, whereas folks in Botswana are being forced much more into settlements by the government, supposedly for their own good, where we can, quote, provide you with an education and teach you some valuable skills, but really the investment there is nothing, and so many of the San people say, look, we'd rather be back on our traditional lands, particularly in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. So yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but your role in the way you see it is to go and find stuff out. Like to be, whether it's an anthropologist or a geologist or just a person, a thinker who goes and tries to, systematize what is happening in the Kalahari with the San people. And as a result, if we know something, then we can hopefully fix it. Is that, am I?
That's right. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So then I guess my question then would be, is it enough to simply know and have everyone know? Is education the silver bullet, I guess is my question. And I go to Gandhi in India, who believed that nonviolent protest would work because we will become knowledgeable in our plight, but those who abuse us will see exactly what they're doing and will have to stop because they just can't sustain this immoral behavior. They will be outraged unto themselves, and we will all realize what's going wrong. And I mean, maybe I'm putting too fine of a point on it, but is that what you hope to do, or is there a little bit more activism that's required here?
There's definitely, that's a great question. So there's definitely activism that's involved. How this started was that it was sort of discovered that even though these, the ṱKhomani in particular, in the far northern Cape in South Africa, received land from the government of South Africa in 1999, thanks to some wonderful efforts of some great folks, including Roger Chennels in South Africa, their land claim attorney. And the land was given back by Nelson Mandela. And then when I was going through kind of the process of exploring what to study for my officially called a DPhil from Oxford, the thing that came out was that the ṱKhomani people were still sitting basically on the side of the highway that led from Uppington up into the Kalahari Park, and not really using their land for anything, not prospering, not having this amazing rebirth of their culture, as Thabo Mbeki said that they should have. They were just still sitting there. And so my original idea was just to go sit down with them and talk to them and find out what was going on. So it really was, let's learn what's happening there. As a result of doing that and having those conversations and doing more research that looked into the situations that might be seen as similar in South America, as well as other parts of Africa, and particularly in the Congo, and then in Australia, what we found was something very interesting. My research showed that when a particularly indigenous, especially if they are hunter-gatherers traditionally, if they have structures forced onto them from an outside group, such as government, and these structures, in many cases, can be related to, oh, well, now you must elect a representative. You must have committees, and you must have recognizable democratic voting procedures that we in Europe or even the South African government, for example, would recognize. If we put those structures onto people who are traditionally hunter-gatherers or indigenous, what happens is they don't protest, they don't get angry, they don't demonstrate in the streets, they just shut down. That seems to be a very common reaction among these groups, and it's not universal, but this is something that I found was happening, and so many outsiders.
What do you mean? I think I know what you mean by shut down, but can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, exactly. So this sense of helplessness, this sense of being sort of chucked once again to the edge of society. We don't have any sense of we don't have on the government side, we don't feel like we have support. We don't have good representation. We don't have people coming here, for example, to teach us to till the land. We haven't done this traditionally. Why isn't the Department of Agriculture showing up and helping us learn these skills? That's one piece of it. The other piece of it is when a group is no longer able to organize themselves, and I mean in terms of their own kind of societal structures, in a way that has meaning for them, that's when kind of the shutdown occurs. They lose their motivation to go out onto the land and do anything with it. And outsiders will come in and say, oh, well, you're lazy, you're ungrateful, you're drunks, you don't care about all of this great stuff we've done for you. That's the typical sort of reaction. And boy, you see that all over the world, right? These sorts of accusations of indigenous folks, you've just given up. Why?
Yeah, it's universal.
It is.
That's right.
Is. And so this is what I found, in particular for the µomani San, that they really felt completely lost and demotivated, and that their traditional culture and the aspects that they wanted to continue were completely unvalued by those folks in power. And so they were really just sort of sitting there doing what they could to create some crafts and sell them to tourists as they went by, and then take that money to the wine shop and get some wine.
Just living day to day, just getting by,
absolutely.
Being adrift.
Yes, and now that's an important point, because for the San people in general, what we see is definitely a view of living day to day. That is a traditional aspect of their culture, because in many, or cultures, because it's quite a lot of variety, of course, but what they would do, a lot of their traditions and their practices were based on changing environmental conditions across their lands, and where the wells and the springs were, and where the rain was going, and where the game was headed. And that led to a certain way of organizing themselves that was based on, okay, for today, we're going to go out and search for tubers, some roots to dig up and eat. So who is good at that? Okay, you're good at that? Great. You're going to be our leader for this small group for today. We're going to go out and find some tubers, and we're going to dig them. Tomorrow, we're going to go on a Hemsbach hunt, and we're going to find the person who feels like they're in the best shape to go lead us on a hunt. So their leadership structures and their organization was very much based on what's available today and who is an expert on this particular thing for right now. And so their leadership structures were very temporary and very fluid.
And fluid, yeah.
Absolutely. And so when outsiders come in, what they see is a complete absence of leadership.
Right, of course.
Where's your chief? Where's the hierarchy? Who are the representatives?
Where's the power?
Right, where's the power? Well, it's this crazy, wonderful, fluid thing, right? And so they would just say, there is no power here. There is no leadership here. In many cases, that made the San less powerful when, for example, the British were coming through, or the Zulu were coming through, or the Boers were coming through, because they, in lots of cases, they weren't able to create that structure under a central leader in order to fight back. Now, sometimes they did, but those structures even still were temporary, and once the threat had passed, they went back to their more fluid structure.
Right, and as we know, the threat's going to come back in 6 months.
Right, exactly, yeah. Right. And so what happened was, when government put in these wonderfully intentioned land reform programs, they came with a lot of that structure. We are giving you back your land, but also with that, we're giving you the wonderful benefits of democracy. Okay, so representative voting committees, elected officials, etc., and it just didn't work. And so what my research is showing is that when you say, okay, we're going to take those structures away, we admit that it doesn't work, when you do that, which is what's happening with the µomani San right now, they suddenly flourish. Suddenly, there's this awakening of, hey, we can structure ourselves as we want. We can have 10 different groups, all doing different things. And we're seeing this in the Kalahari now for the µomani San. They're developing tourist operations and a bush camp that people can come stay in. They have commercial hunting operations where outsiders can come in and pay a lot of money to hunt, and that comes along with tracker training and all these wonderful traditional skills for the San themselves, and then they can pass this on to the future generations. It shows the value of so many of their traditional practices. It's renewing interest in them as another way, once again, to try to make a living out there in the Kalahari. It's showing the value of some of their traditional practices and is really kind of bringing them back. And so we're starting to see that happen, this rebirth of interest in their own culture and their ability to go start. And so to finish kind of answering your question, education is very important here because so many people said we tried for years. We were hitting our head against the wall, not understanding why they weren't responding to this wonderful opportunity we'd given them to go back out on their land. The government of South Africa really does want land recipient groups to be successful and to earn money and to have an income and get off of all the social grants that support so many of South Africans today that are very expensive for the government to run. So the land reform folks really do, and the rural development folks, they want these communities to be successful. So educating them about specific problems, it can have a huge impact. And I've actually talked with some government folks there and some former government folks who say, we want to learn this. The problem is government folks do not read academic journals.
Right.
And so even though I have some things that have come out in book form and other methods, that's not going to have an impact on government. And so what I've been asked to do, actually, is to take some of my research and turn it into a case study on basically the success story that I have seen over the past several years for the ҭKhomani San, turn it into a case study that government folks would be able to read and would be willing to read and want to read, and just say, hey, we're not going to tell you what to do, but here's an example of something that was successful for a land claim group, and we're just going to let you see. We're not going to tell you what to do with this, but just have a look at it, and here are some of the things that we have discovered, because there are a lot of struggling land recipient communities across South Africa who aren't San people, but they're not getting it right in some way. So the more they can learn about that, the better.
A key point for me from Fleming in this conversation so far is this idea in his research that when hunter-gathering groups and societies have structures forced onto them by, say, government, even if those structures are, say, democratic or about voting, they often don't protest or get angry, they just shut down. Now, coming up in this conversation, we ask the question, how do we define the success of a policy? If it's not economic, then what is it about, and how do we measure it? All that's coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. So would a government worker, or even a deputy minister, a minister, a prime minister, a president even, would people in these roles understand what you mean by success in this context? And because we're talking about, as you mentioned a bit earlier, that the San people of the Kalahari have a very different way of operating than we do in, say, Saskatoon, where we are right now. And that their way of operating is not wrong. It's different, and it is responsive to the land. The San people are very, very much in touch with the land. They have to be to live in a desert, right, and to find sources of water in desert melons and in roots of plants that are literally in one of the most harshest environments in the world, or one of the harshest environments in the world. And it's interesting because their response to the land there is similar to the response to the land as Indigenous peoples in Canada, for example, or Native Americans in the United States. And what a lot of governments are saying is, as you just said, you need to adapt. You need to adopt democracy, but you also need to adopt a market system to organize yourselves and to acquire and sell resources. Now, if Indigenous people in, say, Saskatchewan, on a reserve, organize themselves successfully in such a way, then any minister, prime minister, premier in this country would recognize that as quote-unquote success. Because I can read it on a piece of paper, I can see that your GDP has grown, I can see that your level of your inputs and outputs have grown, you're growing more wheat than you were growing before, you're selling more fish than last year, whatever. All of these things make sense from a quote-unquote capitalist point of view. But you're talking about success that is more cultural. You're talking about success that is historical. And would a government worker recognize the success that you've discovered and written about in the same way? Or are you asking them to take a leap of faith into a different paradigm and say success can mean something other than the economic determinants that are in every country on the planet?
I think that's an important question, and I think I'm trying to do really two things here. So one of the pieces here is that recognition. That's so important. You ask me kind of what in the world is going on. A lot of it has to do with power imbalances that are based on a lack of recognition of the value of other views about what society can look like. And there are different versions of democracy we can have kind of structural democracy, we can have representative democracy. What the San people practice is a form of democracy, but it's more participatory. It's more of a system where anyone can come in and have a say. Anyone on any given day can completely change their mind about a particular topic, but it's not being dictated by anyone. So many of the protections in land reform in South Africa have to do with the fear that a traditional leader will come in and subjugate other people under them, particularly women, and reproduce some of these old tribal structures that were actually today considered not healthy. For the San people, especially, the women have just as much power as the men do, and the idea is just that they all come in and have this free-for-all conversation that might go on for days and days and might change from day to day, but what's important to recognize is that's a form of democracy.
Sure.
Yeah.
It sounds like actually what our democracy might be lacking.
Right, exactly.
Is this free-for-all dialogue where we hear people's points of view, but moreover, points of view are allowed to change. It's fluid, using the word that you used before.
Exactly. And so that is part of it. Another part of it I do think is very measurable sort of economic results. Just looking at a group and saying, is this group now self-sustaining? Or are they more self-sustaining than they were before, whether it's from earning income from jobs that we're creating in the area, or whether it's through tourism ventures, or whether it's just being able to go out and hunt again and be able to have access to things that allow them to be sustained. We're seeing that in kind of up in Nunavut. We're seeing it in some of the areas of Australia as well, places and groups who are adapting to the realities of settlement life today, but also continuing a lot of their traditional hunting and gathering structures, but doing so in their own way. So there's a lot, I think, that can be observed there culturally as well as measured economically to make folks happy. And I think in the case of South Africa, it's such a wonderful, they call it Rainbow Nation, right? It's such a wonderful blending of culture, and there's a lot of respect for other cultures, and that's something that they would respond to much more than I think even in the United States today. There would be that sort of reaction. But at the same time, I do think that seeing economic results, helping the government to do its job better, would be a huge benefit to both of the recipient communities and to the government themselves, who can then go on and spend that money in other ways.
There's a word that keeps coming up, and it came up in my research before this conversation. It's coming up now, which is land, the importance and the primacy of land.
Right.
Obviously, there's no human being on this planet which is in what I just said that doesn't relate to the land, where it's everything. Right. There's a book that was written in Canada a few years ago by Thomas King called The Inconvenient Indian. And Thomas King is an Aboriginal Canadian who talks about Aboriginal issues in this book. And one thing that he's very clear about is that it all comes down to land, but also sovereignty. That this question of sovereignty, that the Aboriginal people of Canada need to find some way, some route to sovereignty that is not necessarily Canada, not even maybe within Canada. But what we have a hard time with, obviously, in this country, as with many, is that Indigenous people are all across a massive geography, but they're also very distinct from one another. There is no one group of Indigenous people in Canada. Absolutely. There are hundreds, if not thousands of them.
That's right.
And so this question of sovereignty is fragmented in and of itself. But when we talk about the San people in the Kalahari, we're talking about land, and I know that you've done a lot of work on land and relationship to the land, but the legal status of land reform. How much of this is also about sovereignty, about the right to, whether we're going to call it nationhood or statehood, but to be sovereign unto yourselves in something that is distinct from South Africa, perhaps, as opposed to within it?
So that's really a great question. I've done some work with the UN Permanent Forum on the rights of Indigenous peoples. They, of course, have that Universal Declaration of Indigenous Rights, which is a wonderful document. One of the important things that comes out of that work is that, in many cases, the sovereignty that Indigenous peoples are looking for has to do some with what I've been talking about so far, which is the right to organize themselves in their own ways and to be able to practice as many of their traditional cultural elements as they would like to continue. At the same time, much of that is related to land, and what they're saying is we want we'd love to have ownership of our traditional lands, but if not, we would love to have access to our traditional lands to allow us to go there and visit some of the places that have historic interest to us. And what we've seen so many times, and you see this in the Todilo Hills and in Botswana and some other places where something suddenly gets declared this world kind of heritage monument and some of these preserves, the first thing that happens is they kick the people out. Because they say that they're kind of antithetical to the preservation of the land itself, whereas they say we've been the caretakers of this land since before any of your governments even existed.
Well, and moreover, are intimately connected with this land.
Exactly.
Are the land. I mean,
Right.
you can't have an ecosystem without ecology.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And so one of the things, there's an important kind of distinction there that we have to be careful about, and that is not to define Indigenous people necessarily based on their connection to land, because what's happened for so many of them is that they've been evicted from their lands. And we don't want to say now, well, you don't have access to your land anymore and therefore you're no longer Indigenous. That's a very kind of tricky little trap there. But traditional sort of use and connection to the land in the past and to a particular area of land is definitely something that can be included in that relationship and in that definition.
But I guess this is the trick, right? Is that, well, another of the tricks is that, and one thing that Thomas King talks about, if you don't have sovereignty, then land might not be enough. Then if you don't have sovereignty, then you can access the land all you want. Maybe De Beers, the diamond company, will allow you access to where they're mining for diamonds. But is that truly enough? Because there's still the power imbalance. There's still a sense that I'm only allowed to visit here, even if I feel that my ancestors truly felt were a part of this. Maybe not even using this word ownership, but felt that they were a part of this. But if there's a power at play that can always, at any time, say, no more, you're now evicted. That sovereignty means no one can tell you that. Sovereignty for an Indigenous Canadian means no one's going to come in with the Indian Act, as it's still called in this country, and say, yeah, we've changed the rules and your reserve has been moved, or we're not going to give you the support we promised you last year. If you're sovereign, that does not happen. Right. The only thing that can take away sovereignty is war. Is another country taking it away from you in an act of aggression. And so I guess my question is it possible for the San people of the Kalahari, or Indigenous people anywhere, or people anywhere, to have these inherent rights and to have dignity, which is another big word that's important? Can they have this without sovereignty? Is it possible?
I think it has to be... There's a fine line. I think they have to have the sovereignty in the sense that they have the ability to make decisions and control the land in their own ways, to organize themselves in their own ways, maybe to be able to hunt and gather from that land in their own ways. So many of the restrictions that are coming in now are anti-hunting. Well, you can live here, but you're not allowed to hunt here anymore.
What would that sentiment that make for a hunter-gathering people?
Exactly. And so that's another one of those things where we're seeing kind of a shutdown. Well, what am I supposed to do now?
Right.
At the same time, we know that there's a lot of opposition to Indigenous land claims, particularly in Africa, for a couple of reasons. One, many governments will just say, well, we're all Indigenous.
Of course.
Right. As long as we're not, British colonials, we're all Indigenous. And we've even seen a claim for Indigenous status from the Afrikaners, the Boer.
Well, you could even argue in North America that everyone came here at some point, even if it was 15,000 years ago across the Bering Strait.
Right.
And anyways. Yeah.
So there are people who will try to shatter the hopes of groups in terms of Indigenous rights by saying everyone is Indigenous and therefore you're not entitled to any special treatment. We see that quite a lot, particularly in places like Botswana. At the same time, what we see is a sense that a lot of the opposition to Indigenous land claims are based in the fear that these groups are wanting to secede from the country itself. And so a lot of what the UN Permanent Forum and some of the groups in Southern Africa are doing is saying, look, we haven't seen any evidence that any of these groups really do want to create their own separate country.
Right.
And so we don't want you to quash this as some sort of treasonous or secessionist act. There are different forms of sovereignty, just as there are different forms of democracy. So there is a way to handle this without looking like secessionists.
I think that's a really good point. There are different kinds of democracy, just like sovereignty, and that it's hard for us when we're in our box of what we think democracy and sovereignty is to see it in a different way. I mean, it's interesting because democracy as it is practiced in the Western world is a very removed form of democracy. I mean, the American founding fathers very clearly said we're afraid of mob rule, and we're going to do everything in our power to create a constitution that prevents mob rule. Well, a lot of people would say, is not democracy in its most perfect form mob rule, where people just decide on things? And they would fear what you said about this fluid, temporary movement of power and decision-making in the San context. And yet we think that what we've built here is the epitome of democracy, or some of us do. And I think that that's problematic because it's not allowing a perspective in the wider spectrum that may make us all improve, not just the San people or the Indigenous people of Canada, or even those who want to preserve and protect the American Constitution, for example, but to expand our paradigm and point of view. Yeah, and
you can see that even from the founding of the United States, with all of his complexities and clear issues that we're pulling out more and more these days. Thomas Jefferson was very much of someone who said, look, I believe that we should go and serve our time in Congress and then go back to farming and back to our communities and be a part of the structure there. And we're just, they never conceptualized this idea of career politicians. And that didn't get kind of placed into any of the documents because in some ways there was just this understanding that government representation was temporary anyway.
Right.
So
this
we
kind of
changed
informal,
it a bit.
Kind of an informal agreement without a solid agreement.
Exactly.
It's very interesting because you were a Jefferson scholar, right?
I was, yes.
and just talking about the American founding fathers and how one of the most revolutionary moments for me in the history of the American Revolution was when George Washington, first of all, when he decided not to become the king, because a lot of people wanted him, you've won the war, well, you should just be in charge now. But then, after his 2 terms in office as president, went back home. Did not seek a 3rd term, did not seek being president for life. I think that at the time, because American democracy in its context was brand new, no one knew what this was going to be, if he had decided to rule for life, then it's very conceivable that whoever came after would just be presumed to lead for life.
Absolutely.
And that would go on and on and on. Because the convention, this unwritten convention, that goes back to Cincinnatus, the Roman leader who decided, I'm going to lead until the problem is solved, then I'm going to go back to my farm. Which is the name Cincinnati, which is where it comes from. But it's very interesting because of this unwritten action by the first American president to forego power became the convention of all democracy in the Western world today, which is not written it's written in the amendment that prevents a president from running for a 3rd term. But it's not written that leaders should go for, lead us for a while and then go back, almost in this sort of temporary fluid way of the San people to take it for a little while to solve the problem of the day and then move on.
Exactly. And particularly for Congress folks, I think that's an important lesson. But we also know that sort of idea is prevalent. I heard some of the great sort of volunteers who work with the San and the Kalahari, and they'll say, gosh, I'll say, you've been working with these folks for a long time. When are you finished? When is that? And they say, we only want to be here until they tell us that the problem is solved and they don't want us anymore. They don't want us here anymore. It's time for them to sort of take over. And so that's a nice concept of, this isn't my job. This isn't my career. I'm here to work on something specific. They've asked me for help with this particular area. I'm happy to assist. And then when the time is done, when it's over, when we've solved this, or at least made some significant improvements, then I'll go.
Wouldn't that be an interesting mandate for any nonprofit organization? Is our job is to make ourselves no longer exist.
That'd be great.
I mean, that is what they're. I mean, the
Yes.
American Cancer Foundation, for example, or the Canadian Cancer Society. That's exactly what they're trying to do: is eliminate themselves from existence.
Exactly.
But no one's going to talk about that.
Yes.
No, because there's this sense of the need for permanence in our society.
Exactly. And so much of the criticism of development, in quotes, work that happens around the world that we've seen comes from this idea that, oh, you're here claiming to want to help our community, but what you're really doing is bringing in access for companies to come sell more of their stuff to us, right? And so there's a big kind of claim of that, of saying you're coming here to be a permanent part of our world now, so that we'll buy tractors from you, so that we can plow the fields that you've cleared for us or taught us how to farm. So I think that is definitely the wrong conception of development work. It should be much more of a temporary.
Well, and the corollary
idea.
to that is the development trap, where the moral hazard of pumping money into development programs around the world that simply make those countries or those communities dependent on development funding, rather than, it's the classic question of the welfare state, right? I think we can all agree that the welfare state is a necessary part of our world, but it becomes an evil when it prevents those it serves from, the whole teaching a person to fish, right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to giving them one a day, that whole thing. And I think it's a very important thing, because we've seen the development trap across Africa and many parts of the world. And it's a very real problem that we don't quite have the resources to solve, but one of them should be, or could be, and I think your contention would be that it is, to learn and educate and disseminate knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Is that, am I right?
Yeah, well, I mean, a big part of that seems to be on the part of governments as well, this idea of we know what's best for you. And we see this among indigenous groups, and particularly former and current hunter-gatherer groups in Australia, in the Arctic, and in Africa as well, of government coming in and saying, for your own good, we are pushing you off your land and asking you to live in settlements now. And therefore, we can provide services, also in quotes, for you, including standardized education and skills and access to a health clinic and all of these other things that are meant to be magnets, but that really don't end up providing anything that, in many cases, that the people wanted. And what happens is, what we're seeing is in many cases, when you dig down and find out what was the government really trying to do there, what we find in places like Congo, for example, building roads into the jungle, asking the Mbuti people to kind of clear off their land and come live in these settlements along the roadside, they're just making those people more accessible to taxation. Now we have you all collected in one place. We can sell you things, and we can take money from you to run our
but with
government.
your tax money, we can build you another road that goes into the jungle.
Road, right, that allows poachers to come in and take more of the game that you used to rely upon. So we're seeing places, try to adapt to that. One of the things I was actually mentioning not long ago was in the Arctic, seeing that since so many groups in Nunavut and up in that way have been asked or forced to live in towns or settlements rather than out the way they would have traditionally necessarily, we're seeing that many of them are still, thankfully, wanting to hunt as part of their traditional culture, and the men are still very much involved in that, but they have adapted their own traditional practices to what the government has done supposedly for their own benefit. But one of the things that's happened is, in many cases in these towns, the women are finding waged work, and they are therefore now much more involved in the hunting operation, much more than they would have been necessarily in past generations. And that's because their wages are going to buy fuel for the snowmobiles that the men then have to take to go out, because they have to travel so much further now to get out to their traditional hunting grounds. So it's fascinating how even those traditional practices are being adapted as governments, in some cases, maybe with good intentions, maybe without, are sort of forcing some of these settlement structures onto.
Well, it's interesting because we're talking about the role of government too, and I worked in government for a while, and I can tell you that it's hard not to go down the track of, well, we know better, because often, I mean, government does know better than an individual who is not conscious of what's happening in the wider world, but only in regards to what are we trying to achieve. if a government is trying to achieve the raising of, for example, per capita GDP, probably knows better how to do that than a collection of 35 million Canadians, for example, all together pursuing their own thing. I mean, some would say that the government is doing its best job if it just liberates them and gets things out of their way so that they can pursue their own objectives and raise their per capita GDP, for example. But if all you're doing as a government is raising your wealth of a nation, then you're missing all the other accoutrements of humanity, such as the pursuit of dignity, the pursuit of happiness. Can a San person of the Kalahari who was raised in that society feel that they have dignity if they are simply transplanted across the continent to do a job that they never understood before, working in a factory, but making enough money more money than they were ever making before? Well, money doesn't have the same value. Yes, a government is achieving its goal by doing so, but we're narrowing the perspective and what the need of government is. We're also asking, how does government evolve in its role over time? 200 years ago, no government was trying to raise the per capita GDP of its country, and so it seems almost ridiculous to compare that to today. But I guess, I'm just throwing that out there, the role of government and how we face that.
So I think that's a good question. So I am all for, one of the things that I strongly believe in is the ability, and again, this is in the kind of the context of my own work with the San people, but their ability as individuals to make those choices about their own career trajectory and the types of work that they would like to do. So no, please do not load them in trucks and send them across to work in the mines in Gauteng. We don't want that. At the same time, if they want to go to Bloemfontein in order to get a wage job and send the funds back to their family in many cases. That is a huge part of South African culture. This kind of migrant work ethic has started a very long time ago, particularly when the mines first started to open up and some of the agriculture, people would move around to kind of where the income was. And that's considered a normal part of South African society. At the same time, when someone makes those choices, it's important to recognize that they are still, in this case, San people or Bushmen. They're choosing that route. And so I had a great conversation with one of the ಠKhomani San leaders in Uppington one time, and he told me, he said, I am a hunter. Even though I have a job in Uppington and I'm a deacon in a local church here, I am still a hunter. That is something that's on the inside of me. That's how I think about myself and my relationship to the world and to land. And just because I've made this career choice doesn't mean that that's gone away. And they looked at me and he said, you may consider yourself a Scottish person, but that doesn't mean you're walking around wearing a kilt all the time.
Right.
You don't need that in order to have that inward view of who you are and your identity. That doesn't have to depend on the choices that you make career-wise, because in particular with the San people, they have always adapted to the economic conditions in their area, and they've always adopted all sorts of different ways of making a living, and so that's perfectly fine, of course. But I think to go to your education question, it's really important, I believe, that the folks in government who are working very hard in order to improve the circumstances of different groups, however that might look. In some cases, it's economic. Usually, that will be a component of it. But in some other places, in other cases, it might be we want to feel a connection to our traditional culture again, and we want to have that sense of sovereignty over our own land. I think the education piece definitely comes in making sure that government understands what the different conceptions of, leadership and structure and democracy and sovereignty are for the different groups that they're trying to deal with. And I think as academics and researchers, that's something where we can actually contribute something valuable in a digestible sort of way, and we're not trying to summarize entire cultures. Of course, we don't want to be doing that. But if there are ways that we can help government understand the value of the differences that are there, or at least recognize, so much of this involves recognition of different cultural aspects, I think we can have a big impact through that educational piece.
Well, and I think recognition sounds like a very important first step, if not the only possible first step, when the second and third and fourth step are about dignity and respect and human happiness, and living out who you actually are deep down inside. Fleming, final question for you.
Okay, sure.
As we close up, I often ask this one, which is, if there was one thing that we didn't talk about today that you wish we did, what would that be?
This is such an awesome kind of ongoing conversation, and then there's so many wonderful things that come out of this topic. I think there are important debates on all sides of this. I think if I could add something to the conversation, I would want to talk more about the need for Indigenous voices. It's not just about us describing their cultures and providing that information to government, but I think more and more the really great research that's coming out is involving the communities themselves, not just as little helpers, but as actual contributing authors to the research and voices in the dissemination of that research. That's a very powerful area right now, and it has so much more impact. A lot of the areas that we talk about when it comes to recognition are governments even recognizing the traditional leadership of certain people within the community or leadership structures, and allowing the Indigenous groups to be able to explain and to describe and to tell stories. Especially the San people are the greatest storytellers, just to tell stories about their relationship to the land and how they used to live, and the ways they see the world through their different languages and the different ways of describing sand and running and all these wonderful
and
things.
And they can be quite funny too.
They're hilarious. Yeah. They're hilarious. The first time I met them in the Kalahari, I was approaching them and I was so nervous. And what happened was an ostrich came up behind me and started doing the ostrich mating dance. And here I am, nervous as I could be, and seeing the San people over in the distance. And here is this, and I actually stopped and verbally tried to explain to the ostrich how there was no way that this could work out, but I appreciated the gesture. And I kept walking. The ostrich would run up a few steps saying, no, I was doing it wrong. Let me try again. I look over and the San people are rolling in the sand laughing at me. And this was our introduction. The sort of humor and the teasing about that got our relationship kind of off on the right foot. So but yes, they are very funny.
That's
people,
wonderful. Fleming, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a really great conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I really enjoy talking about all this. So thank you for making this possible.
To learn more about Fleming Puckett, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes and a way to get in touch with me to give me your feedback about them and to let me know what you think we should do for future episodes. Now, your quote of the week is from a San activist named Roy Sasana, who was born in 1950. He says, "We are not primitive. We live differently to you, but we do not live exactly like our grandparents did, nor do you. Were your ancestors primitive? I don't think so. We respect our ancestors. We love our children. This is the same for all people." Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein for this wonderful music, and special thanks to the Holiday Inn Saskatoon East for giving us the space in which to record. Next week, I'm talking with the executive editor of The Walrus in Toronto, Jessica Johnson. I'll see you then.